Alright guys, I'm going to take credit where credit's due. In my meta prediction video, I managed to accurately guess the bottom 3 classes, 2 of the 3 top classes, as well as the best warrior and priest decks. I also at least mentioned the majority of other decks that have seen success. My major mistakes were with predicting mage, hunter, and paladin, but even there I managed to get some major points correct. You can nitpick and say I overestimated Omega cards and underestimated odd mech paladin, but compared to how accurate I expected to be, I consider this a great success. I can't wait until next expansion, where I take what I learned here and predict the meta even better. Penniless, are you actually that confident? No! Most of my meta predictions were pure luck. Let's face it, I am not Superman, I am Captain Hindsight. Greetings and welcome to Hearthstone Theory. With 2.5 weeks of the Boomsday expansion completed, we have once again experienced the beauty of a changing metagame. Most Hearthstone content creators probably made a bold declaration about the meta last week, but I decided to wait an extra week to, conduct more research. More accurately, I was playing the game a huge amount because frankly, this expansion is lots of fun. But of course, the expansion isn't flawless. Such a concept is mathematically impossible. Some decks have better win rates than others, and it's imperative to understand why. Which decks are contesting for the top spot? What do these deck archetypes have in common? And most importantly, what's going to get nerfed? Well, I can only provide so many answers, but today I will be parsing through this data to come up with a model for the meta. A theory, if you will. By the end of this, hopefully we can understand what the current state of the meta is, what caused it to get to that state, and what will happen in the future. Leave questions and thoughts in the comments, etc, etc, etc. Let's begin. Let's address perhaps the most important point right out of the gate. The meta right now is incredibly diverse. Each of the 9 classes has at least 2 feasible archetypes. Zoolock and Evenlock, Malygos and Togwaggle, Tempo and Big Spell. The only exception is Priest, which has 1 strong control deck and 3 OTK decks that people keep trying despite a lack of success. There are arguably over a dozen decks in use at the moment, and it's not clear which of these decks is the best. Meanwhile, if you ask around, players can't quite generate a consensus as to which class is the most overpowered right now. Hunter, Warlock, or Druid. Here's a case example of this diversity phenomenon. Spell Hunter. Before the expansion released, Spell Hunter was not looking particularly likely to succeed. Of the 5 new class spells, 2 of them demanded mech synergies, 1 wouldn't work with this deck, and 1 kinda sucked. All that was left was Secret Plan, and everyone can understand why we didn't think much of Secret Plan. It certainly isn't meta-defining, and yet, Spell Hunter has proven fantastic. The only explanation is that other cards in other decks shifted the meta enough for this variant of hunters to take advantage. But the fact that this deck serves better in this meta than in the previous one, when all the pieces of the old game are still in circulation, goes to show that there's pretty even ground at the moment. How did we get here? Before the expansion, players were terrified of the potential for Druid to annihilate all, but right now their win rate is relatively average. On day 1, I faced very few Druids. The most popular one was a Mechathune Druid made by Disguised Toast, and that deck didn't last. Now don't get me wrong, Druids are still a definitive part of the meta. The entire class is able to utilize strong combinations faster than others, and with Boomsday in particular, the class received many pieces that could further help it in this regard. However, here's the thing, the strongest Druid combo cards don't work together. Floop Oaken Summons, Floop Dream Petal, Hadronox versus the Death Knight and Spreading Plague, these pieces do not properly align. And cards like Juicy Psychmelon demand synergies that simply aren't there. Not even Big Druid with Tyrantus runs this card. Wild is a different story, but Wild is always a different story. This jumble of strong cards that don't fit together has resulted in exactly what you'd expect. Druid has multiple powerful archetypes that all do approximately the same thing. Get to the endgame, then win instantly. In order of popularity, Malygos, Togwaggle, Token, Taunt, and Big. Spiteful Druid breaks this trend, but that deck is currently the least popular of the Druid decks, despite its relative success. While each of these decks employs different stratagems or leaves out particular cards, the theme remains the same. Druids are the kings of combo, and even if one of these decks struggles, another may fare halfway decently. This is the point to bring up Spreading Plague, a clear contender for nerfage. The thing about this card is its tech against token decks, which always have the potential to be prevalent. But there are 2 problems with this card, the first being, it's pretty much the only defensive card Druid has, atrocious armor gain excluded. Second, there is tech against this tech, in the form of Mossy Horror and Void Ripper. So while this card makes Druid more rounded, a general weakness for aggro still exists, a weakness that is exploited by one major deck, Zoolock. Zoolock is actually an interesting case study. In the middle of the post-nerf Witchwood meta, a package including Voodoo Doctor, Light Warden, and Happy Ghoul shot this deck straight to top tier. Think about that for a moment. In the last month, this deck went from non-existent to being the most used deck in the game, and it utilizes a card from the basic set that, to my knowledge, has never seen play before this. That's insane. My hypothesis is that Zoolock is actually slightly stronger than Blizzard initially planned. After all, this heal package came out of nowhere, and then Blizzard gave the deck Doubling Imp and the Solarium this expansion. Two cards that are okay by themselves, but very strong in an aggressive strategy. This, plus the fact that Zoolock can destroy Druids across the board, makes it a very prevalent deck at the moment. Evenlock is just as strong, but it's not quite as meta-defining simply because it's slower. It's actually right on the subject of Evenlock where things become very important. While Zoolock is certainly powerful, we need to remember, it runs cards like Voodoo Doctor. This deck is far from invincible. Any class with a board clear can feasibly eliminate it, like Evenlock with Defile and Hellfire. There's also Big Spell Mage, Spell Hunter, Control Priest. Even Paladin has also managed to find a niche here. And other decks can beat Zoolock at their own game. Odd Rogue is aggressive enough to annihilate Warlock in general, and even Shaman currently exists as the rare gem in the meta that you rarely see, but when you do, it hands you your ass. The Druid Collective can beat some of these decks, but not others. And then each of these decks has unique interactions with the others, which further complicates everything. And somewhere in here, Odd Paladin exists, beating some decks like Hunter, but losing to others like Druid. When I said a dozen decks were competing for the top spot in the meta, I wasn't exaggerating. You'd think that with all of these classes colliding, the strongest cards in the meta would then be neutral cards. And while neutral cards in general are certainly seen play, there are a few standout cards that are must-haves in multiple decks. Most of the neutral cards are powerful in select circumstances, be they cornerstone aggressive cards or powerful pieces like the Lich King. There's also Baku and Gen, but longtime viewers know I've talked about them at length. All that said, there is one major card that is standing out across multiple deck archetypes. We are of course talking about Giggling Inventor. This card was rated moderately high, but I don't think the Hearthstone community expected it to be as meta-defining as it has become. I will come forward and admit that I definitely underestimated this card. Craft it golden. All types of decks can use this as a defensive tool, and it synergizes strongly with token-style effects. Without an answer, this card is practically equivalent to the spell Blizzard, except you can proactively play it and generate synergies off of it. Offensively, defensively, or even just as filler, this card does its job. I personally don't have a problem with this card being this strong for 3 reasons, the first being Mossy Horror. This card instantly punishes whoever plays Giggling Inventor, which overall negates its power. Second, Druid's Spreading Plague, while also a little too powerful, counters this smoothly. And third, this card generally slows the game down. Playing it delays death in slower decks, and while it keeps its ally minions safe in other fast decks, it itself isn't actually offensively oriented. It simultaneously makes decks harder to counter, but easier to adjust to, which further aids in keeping this meta healthy. Though don't get me wrong, I can understand how players can view this card as more frustrating. I too get that pang of annoyance when it hits the field. But in terms of overall meta health, where we want different decks that can counter each other, Giggling Inventor actually does more to help than to hinder that. However, there is one small exception, one deck that is at the top purely because of the Inventor, Deathrattle Hunter. While Giggling Inventor and Mossy Horror brawl it out, Deathrattle Hunter got creative and decided to use both of them. The Inventor to buy for time, and the Horror to both kill opposing Inventors and to break Devilsaur eggs. It's actually quite beautiful, and much less frustrating than the OTK version of this deck from the Witchwood. That leads me to my final point on this meta, Hunter in general. At the time of this recording, Hunter is on top, and it's not just because of the Deathrattle deck. Spell Hunter is likewise doing well, and a few less popular decks like Secret Hunter are actually viable. This is once again for complicated reasons, but the main ones are that Hunter's hero power allows it to push face if it needs to, and Deathstalker Rexar makes an otherwise doomed matchup potentially end in success. That, plus powerful synergies and conditional cards, makes this a class to be reckoned with. So, to summarize, Druids are the combo kings, but Zoolock beats them, but lots of things beat Zoolock, and the strongest card in the game slows down most matchups while still having weaknesses. Side effects include creative decks like Death Rattle Hunter that exploit these aspects of the meta for maximum synergy. Is this the healthiest meta in Hearthstone's history? Right now, every class has decks that can work, from Zoolock to Control Priest. Each class also has multiple archetypes, and classes that seem to be defined by one deck have a perfectly viable second option. Even the bottom class, Priest, is only as low as it is because people can't stop playing that topsy-turvy combo Priest that has like a 30% win rate. That's not all though. A diverse meta also means that players can experiment and try new decks outside of the meta. I've been playing a mech hunter that includes Cybertech Chip and Harvest Golem, which are the best performing cards in that deck. These two cards are practically considered non-existent, and yet my moderate success with the deck continues. Other hidden archetypes could easily exist, much like Zoolock was before its discovery. This status quo seems very healthy, with the variety of decks keeping the game diverse. That said, I'm fully admit bias. After all, the whole time I've been writing this script, I've been asking myself, why aren't I playing more Boomsday instead? But that bias could also be viewed as evidence, albeit anecdotal evidence. So with all that said, what comes next? It takes Blizzard between a month and 3 months to release a balance patch for an expansion, and my guess is that this one will come a bit on the later side. Every expansion, Adventures excluded, has had a balance change come with it, and I see no reason for Blizzard to discontinue that trend. So here is my best guess for how it will turn out. With Hunter and Warlock at the top of the meta, it's clear they are prime targets for nerfs. For Hunter, Deathstalker Rexxar is the only viable target for a nerf, and I really don't want this to get nerfed, guys. Deathstalker Rexxar prevents the smork. We don't want the smork. So if it were me, I would either just raise the mana by 1 or leave it untouched. Hunter's success is largely dependent on the meta around it at this moment, so ignoring it isn't the worst so long as we can change enough other things, notably Giggling Inventor. Like I said, this card seems healthy for the meta, but its ubiquity is troubling. So I would change its 2 attack to 1 attack. Less aggressive, less powerful at trading, but it still gets its job done. Such a nerf would lessen its presence just a little, which would weaken Death Rattle Hunter and open up options for new decks, if ever so slightly. Warlock is somewhat more challenging to cut down, since no particular card in it is particularly overpowered. Right now the entire class is very powerful. The only card Zoolock and Evenlock have in common is, I kid not, Spellbreaker. Short of destroying each deck's powerhouse cards, Kobold Librarian and Blood Reaver Gul'dan, the only strategy Blizzard has left is to continue forward and give Warlock weaker cards as time goes on. Oh, they're already doing that. Okay then, carry on! And finally, there's Druid. Guys, we need to talk about Druid. I underplayed them this video because frankly they're only doing okay in Standard, but in Wild they're running rampant. That plus Standard Druid having 4 decks that are all basically the same deck goes to show that something is definitely rotten in the state of Denmark. And at the core of it all is 2 cards, Nourish and Wild Growth. 90% of Druid's Standard and Wild decks run these 2 cards. Yikes! This problem is too complicated to go over right now, but basically Blizzard has a choice to make. Leave Wild to be ruled by their Druid overlords, nerf Aviana and stay the course, or rip out the core of what makes Druid what it is. I don't know what the best solution is there, so I'll just have to wait. Good luck, Blizzard. I hope you make us proud. Final note, Spreading Plague. It's a huge problem and should die miserably in the dirt. I'd love to explain why, but this video is long enough. I'll cover that topic more thoroughly when it happens, and I'm betting it will happen. Aside from that card, this meta is the best one I have examined. Every class in the game has a story to tell this expansion. Control, tokens, ramp, shutterwalk, tempo, death rattle, it's all here. More classes means more cards means more decks means more diversity, and more diversity means a healthier meta. Are there blemishes? Absolutely. Does Wild need help? Absolutely. Does Arena need help? I honestly don't know. I'll have to ask some friends how that game mode is doing. But for the standard meta of the Boomsday expansion, all I have to say is, well played.